Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Love Procurement Podcast. My name is Kelly Barner, and I'll be your host for today's conversation. I am glad to welcome Saima Sabir and Arnaud Malardé to the show. Earlier this year, Saima joined Ivalua for an event in London where she moderated a dynamic panel titled Navigating the Evolving Landscape of Third-Party Risk Management in Financial Services. And we are looking forward to building on that conversation today. So Saima and Arnaud, thank you both so much for being with me.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Now, Saima, let me start with you. There's a lot of risk in the world today. What is it about third-party risk that makes you feel so passionate about it, as opposed to something maybe the rest of us feel a little bit of anxiousness?
I would definitely say that the thing that makes me passionate about third-party risk management, and I sound like a broken record, Kelly, because I say this every time I'm discussing third-party risk management, is it's very strategic in nature. So the great thing about it is it's a niche risk within itself, but it touches on other areas of risks and different organizations and actually cross-industry. So that's the part that's something that makes me passionate about third-party risk management.
Now, Arnaud, we've heard some great things about that panel session and the discussion that took place in London. Do you mind sharing a few of your key takeaways from that session?
Yeah, sure. So obviously we talked about how strategic it is, but we also talked a lot about how burdensome it can be, right? Because it's a lot of work for many companies. And so in the course of this discussion, we try to find ways to alleviate this burden for some of the companies. And what we came up with is that obviously you need to ask things when it's relevant, because a lot of the time especially in financial services, you ask a lot of things to the business, a lot of details, a lot of information you need to report on, or you need to get before you get into any agreement, any contract. So it's a lot of burden on the business side, let's say. And the idea was to obviously ask when it's relevant. You ask if you're like outsourcing your payment system, maybe because it's critical. You won't ask the same type of questions or the same amount of questions if you're just buying a pen, for instance. Yeah. So that was one of the first takeaways. And the second one was obviously automate the gathering of data, because the reporting sits on a lot of data. And if you automate the data, how you gather it, if you share, because the data is spread between, the suppliers know some part of the information, the business knows some other parts of the information, procurement knows some of the information. So if you asking the right and appropriate questions to the right people, you just reduce the burden, I think. So these were the two takeaways from this panel.
Now, Saima, before we start to dig a little bit deeper, is there anything that has changed significantly enough since that session in London that we should acknowledge it at the outset?
I think the things to think about that are forever changing within the world of procurement is how the current geopolitical climate is. So supply chain is forever evolving, and especially with regulation. So whilst we know that DORA is a January compliance, we're now seeing how that's moving forward, and how not just only financial services or firms, actually how suppliers like Ivalua and ICT suppliers are working through this. So those are things that we should be acknowledging.
Yeah. Now, it was interesting that you described third-party risk management as sort of one relatively niche category of risk. Speaking as a procurement supply chain person, we think third-party risk is all of the risk, right? Because in our world, that is so the focus. But even within third-party risk management, there are a number of categories of risk, or maybe sources of risk, I should say, that we need to be focused on. Can you share a few examples of sort of the next level down of detail, the types of risk that we should be looking at within third party?
Yeah, I think obviously in the current climate that we're working in or operating in, definitely think about concentration risk. And actually, this is something we touched on at the event, which was really good, because we're looking at actually how a supplier is operating, and concentration risk being as to where that kind of aggregate would be, where there may be a risk to many organizations, not just only one. And especially when you're looking at the geopolitical landscape, so where there may be areas where you have concerns around business continuity of services, how is that operating? Not just from an individual perspective, but from a geographical perspective as well. So there are things that you would be considering as a part of it. And obviously your life cycle i.e. ongoing monitoring and how this is operating and your relations with the suppliers.
And to address most of these sort of subtypes of third-party risk, of course, data is going to be the answer, which connects back to something you said, Arnaud, about the opportunity to use automation to better manage the collection or centralization of data. How would you say data integrity comes into the challenge of mounting either a defense or an offense when companies are looking to handle third-party risk?
To me, it comes first. First and foremost, you need to think about what I call data integrity. Even before you think, especially when you choose or you use some technology, many times people just tend to look at the list of functionalities and think, oh, is my technology doing this and that? That's good to see, but with technology, you can add up new functionalities. What you cannot do is change the way the data is already embedded and the data models. And so what I call data integrity and why it's very important, it's you need to see first if the data is flowing in the right format and if you don't lose data across the process. Let me give you an example. Most of the time, if you use different tools for your sourcing events, for your contracting parts, for your P2P and ordering process, well, you lose information along the way. Think about one of the things. Imagine you're in a bank and you need to have an alternate supplier, right? For any critical type of spend you have. What if you could, in case a risk arise on this category, directly take from your sourcing event the second best offer? That would be your alternate supplier, for instance. And you could directly draw this information from a sourcing event you had in the past. In the moment you do like an evaluation of your current supplier, for instance. So if you have this information which is flowing across all the steps of the processes, you're able to gain time and really find the right appropriate information. So that's one thing I call like integrity of data, the data that flows in the same format and which you don't lose along the way. And the second thing which is very important to maintain this data integrity is to make sure that you have two repositories right. The supplier repository, which need to be unique, and also a unique repository for contracts. Again, if you have different databases for contracts and suppliers, and you look at risk, well, if you have a risk for a certain supplier based only on half, like the occurrences of the supplier, you only look at half of the picture. And so you might be at a riskier position that you even think about. So again, data integrity is very important. Above all, data. Afterwards, you think about the functionalities and the calculations and how you transform data.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring up sort of where the process within procurement connects to the different parts of the tech stack. And because you mentioned supplier data specifically as something that needs to be well managed, how much overlap would you say there is between third-party risk management as sort of the broad topic and either supplier risk or even supplier performance management sort of more specifically?
So I tend to see like TPRM, third-party risk management, as an enhanced version of supplier risk management, especially because that's a concept coming from financial services. And the way they look at it is they don't look at the supplier risk on its own. They look at the relationship between a bank and a supplier. And so they look at the risk of this relationship. And in the risk of this relationship, one component is the, let's say, sole risk of the supplier, what we say the inherent risk of the supplier. But then there is obviously how much you're exposed to this relationship. So how much spend, how critical this category of services you buy is for your business, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, that's the real risk position, because if you take two different like customers working with the same suppliers, the inherent risk of the supplier, because his financials has a certain state, because his business is in a certain shape, is the same for both of them. But the two customers will have a different risk position based on their relationship, because one will buy like a very critical payment outsourcing facility, whereas the other one will just buy like a mouse and mice for the computers, for instance. So yeah, that's something that I learned from financial services, and I think that's something like most procurement professionals need to know.
Yeah. And especially since we are talking about financial services, obviously every vertical or every industry has its own category of risk that it's most concerned about. But within financial services, Saima, looking at regulatory risk, because rules and regulations are not only different by geography or jurisdiction, they're also constantly changing over time. How do all of these changing expectations and updates or new regulations really play a role into third-party risk management strategies?
Okay, so you're very much right in saying that as to how we're looking at that. Generally speaking, a lot of regulation tends to look at actually talking about your business strategies or your outsourcing strategies. So, positively speaking, the regulators themselves are thinking strategically around this. And the key common goal is trying to create harmonization where possible around regulation in order to allow financial services and or firms to effectively work within their own risk appetite, but also meeting the law. So that is something that I would say is very key. And it's also important when you're looking at this as from an industry lens as to how other organizations are operating around it. One of the biggest things that are coming through at the moment with regulations is the enhancement of discussing things around pooled audits, and pooled audits as such where you've got different organizations coming together to create an audit to make it easy for processing wise. But again, we won't go into the semantics here, but these are the type of things that they look at in terms of helping. But the key takeaway is harmonization of frameworks, and that's where regulators are also trying to support to look at that across the regulations that impact firms.
And when you talk about harmonization, do you mean that the different regulatory bodies are trying to become more consistent, more similar, or simply to make sure that what they are advocating for through these regulations makes sense for one organization that's trying to comply with them all?
Yeah, so they are definitely trying to help with consistency. Obviously, it depends on your geographical location and then the threats within that particular country as to what they're looking at and the challenges. So some regulators may have a higher prescribed responsibility towards third-party risk management. But in fairness, when you look at it holistically, you'll have, like, say, the senior management certification regime, which talks about third-party risk management in the capacity of outsourcing and those prescribed responsibilities, as well as, say, the Digital Operational Resilience Act and how that works individually and organizationally as well in terms of prescribed responsibilities. What you tend to find, and I think my experience of obviously working within different financial service institutions or firms is there tends to be a bit of a worry at the beginning of, oh, we've got this new legislation that's coming in. There's so much that we need to do. And actually, what you find is the beauty of regulation tends to harmonize on the basis that it's almost like there's a slight upgrade taking place each time where they're looking at the regulation. So a lot of firms are prepared to a degree. It's just in case of enhancement to meet compliance and effectively operate. So, yeah.
That's why you're the right person to be focused on this, Saima. Where the rest of us feel anxiety, you see beauty and harmony. So thank goodness for that. Talk about right person, right position. Arnaud, this role of regulation seems so incredibly critical within financial services. I want to give you the opportunity to weigh in on it as well, either in addition to some of the details that Saima shared, or even as all of that information starts to connect with procurement-specific priorities around the parts of third-party risk that they're actively managing.
One, especially if we look at the DORA regulations, which is about digital resilience. You know, the source or the roots of this regulation is the following. Most of the time, cybercriminality is not achieving, penetrating the banks or the big institutions directly through their systems. They actually enter through a third party, maybe a fourth party, so a supplier of their suppliers, which most of them have a weaker requirements in terms of cybersecurity. And that's where they find a weak link and how they can, get back up onto the bank systems, for instance. So that's why we have this regulation. So eventually it's to prevent and to make people aware of these flaws or weaknesses that exist in their supply chain. That's one thing, and I think it's beneficial in terms of risk preparation point of view. And the second thing is in the terms and in the clauses that need to be embedded in these contracts with, critical third parties, especially digital third parties, there is a focus and emphasis on the data. Where is the data hosted geographically? How can you retrieve this data? Because sometimes it sits in the hands of the third party, of the supplier. How, as a customer, do you retrieve this data? Should the supplier just go bankrupt, for instance, or have a service discontinuity? So again, I think the regulator has sensed, and I've seen these threats in terms of cybersecurity, has also seen that data has become more and more geographically bound, let's say. We used to think that data it's anywhere on the cloud and it's everywhere available. Okay, that's true. But more and more, if you see, you need to have servers locally based for most of the requirements and most of the customers. So that also tells something about how globalization used to be and how we are getting back to, let's say, more regional thinking and businesses.
As well as the level of technical understanding that procurement has to have. I mean, I'll admit I'm one of the first people that thinks like, well, where is the data? Well, it's in the internet, which means it's everywhere, right? But ultimately, despite our user experience, that data does sit someplace. I think that's a great example of where we need to think about both the accessibility of information. We want it to be central. We want it to be safe. But at the same time, there is a physical location associated with that data. And knowing where in the world it is absolutely a key part of third-party risk management. Now, Saima, I had commented earlier that I think for a lot of procurement and supply chain professionals, third-party risk equals risk, right? So that's our perspective. That's our world that we're focused on. If we take a look at that idea from the outside in, and instead look at how the C-suite or the rest of the organization looks at third-party risk, how different is the way they see it from the way procurement or supply chain might see it?
I think definitely touching on earlier conversations, and actually this thought was running through my head whilst we were talking, and it goes back to what Arnaud had mentioned earlier about the connectivity. Now, when we look at third-party risk management, we're looking at this from inception to completion. And this actually looks at how a firm's risk appetite statement is, or a risk management framework is operating. As we know, as I earlier touched on, is that actually third-party risk management is strategic in nature. So if we're looking at, say, operational risk, some firms have third-party risk management within the risk appetite of operational risk. So it's as one of the levels. However, this is about you looking at actually, are we in a position to feel that important business services are protected and they can be operationally resilient? So going back to the Digital Operational Resilience Act, how is critical infrastructure within the firm? Then obviously the critical third parties being the third party risk management of the oversight, how is that operating from inception to completion? So that's what we tend to look at. And then obviously externally facing with the suppliers, and then going back to the point of the locations. So there are many, as I would put it, as a spider's web that tend to happen when you're reviewing, but it's about being very key and crucial to your own risk management framework that you have within your bank and what you're looking to support on your important business services, and everything then falls through thereafter as to how you're doing your categorization.
Now, when we think about those frameworks in support of compliance, procurement a lot of times talks about this in terms of governance plans, governance strategies, something that we're formally putting in place to guide our activities to make sure that we're keeping front and center any of the concerns associated with remaining compliant. How can ongoing governance programs, even ones that exist outside of a third-party risk management focus, help us achieve perhaps new procurement goals and objectives in this area?
I would definitely say this is where actually the governance part is very much now coming from the top. It's the filtration from top down and bottom up. So effective communication, effective, robust governance that's actually incorporated into your corporate governance structures, and how is that operating? That is the area that we tend to look at. And actually, we're finding that legislation is moving towards that direction as well. We can definitely see it with the Digital Operational Resilience Act. And prior to the Digital Operational Resilience Act, you have obviously the industry guidance on outsourcing via the Central Bank of Ireland, as well as then the PRA statements on operational resilience, as well as third-party risk management and outsourcing, talking about management bodies and the board and how their engagement is. So it's quite crucial in today's day and age to be thinking about that. And the next thing we'll find moving forward is actually that maturity level, in my personal opinion, will start applying to suppliers, given that they have a requirement now to feed back to the regulator, who is their lead overseer, as to how they're operating. So I see a lot of opportunities, but a lot of change taking place in that space for suppliers. And they will most probably benefit from speaking to risk people about how they can help mature that, especially if they fall into the critical supplier list.
Yeah. Now, we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, and this is of high strategic importance, Saima, as you've said a few times, especially to financial services organizations. So I want to give each of you an opportunity to offer sort of a piece of parting advice. Arnaud, maybe starting with you. For people that are listening in, that have joined us, who are watching this conversation, what would be a piece of advice, sort of an opportunity to share the love here in the Love Procurement podcast for people that are either really starting to take on an active role within procurement, but with regard to third-party risk, or groups that already have a program in place and are looking to mature and advance that program? What piece of advice would you like to leave them with?
I think there is one part of risk management that might be overlooked. It's looking at your suppliers and see the rest of the relationships you have with them. So sometimes, and many times, it's often, you have a supplier. It might also be a customer of yours. It might also be a competitor of yours. It might also be a partner in some sort of business. And so let me just tell you like a short story which happened to me in the past when I was a buyer. So I was conducting this sourcing event on laptops and all this kind of hardware. And like in the late stages, we decided to go for a new supplier instead of the incumbent. And eventually the incumbent, which was a very big customer of our company, called top management and say, well, your procurement department wants to save 300,000 euros, but our company actually provides you 1 million euros. So, well, the equation is not quite working. And eventually, obviously, we did not change the supplier. Yeah. And so had we had this kind of mapping somewhere of what a supplier is at the same time in our relationship with him, is he a supplier, is he a competitor? We would have saved a lot of time, a lot of trouble in the organization, maybe less tension in the relationship with this entity, right? So I think that's something we need to look at, especially nowadays with the big ones like Amazon, Google, because they are in every type of business. Yeah, we think about them. Okay, they are just in Google Analytics, right? But maybe Google isn't in other things, or maybe Google can very quickly get into other businesses. So we definitely need to look at the relationship in the overall company.
Yeah. That is an excellent piece of advice. I would like to say, Arnaud, I have also had that happen to me in my practitioner days.
Really?
And the only way I can think to describe it is heartache. The moment when someone from leadership comes knocking on procurement's door and says, are you threatening to take away such and such a company's contract? Please spare yourself that experience and take this advice from Arnaud. You will be so glad if you make it a part of your process going forward to check and see if any of those incumbent or prospective suppliers are currently on the revenue side of the house. Saima, I will give the last word to you. What sort of parting thought or final piece of advice would you like to share with everyone?
I would definitely say don't underestimate the gravitas of third-party risk management and outsourcing. Yeah. Obviously, touching on what Arnaud said about relationship management is crucial, right? So it's about how are you operating and managing those relationships. But more so, it's an evolving door. And especially with the likes of AI and the new future and new legislations and innovation that's coming through, it's going to be ever more now important to be able to manage third-party risk management, whether you're a supplier or a firm. and how are you actually engaging with the industry with that? So my sharing parting gift would be, don't underestimate it.
Yeah.
There are strategic ways to manage these things, as well as ring fencing, because it can be quite difficult and quite tedious, like a spider's web. But it's about how you as a firm or an organization is strategically managing it and controlling it so you can effectively deliver.
Yeah. Well, Saima, Arnaud, I want to thank both of you so much for all of the information and the spirit of calm with which it was delivered. I appreciate you both being here to share your expertise to build on that earlier conversation about third-party risk management in financial services that took place in London. And of course, thank you to everybody who's joined us to listen in or to watch this conversation.